Welcome everyone to the Old Schwamb Mill's May lecture program. This is the sixth in a series of virtual talks that began in October, and then we'll start them up again in the fall. It should be known that the talk this evening and two other talks in the series were funded by the Bridge Street sponsorships through the support of the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Mass Cultural Council, and we thank them for that support. And this evening, we're delighted to have as our speakers Dr. Robert Krim and Alan Earls. And Dr. Krim teaches at Framingham State University. He's an associate professor of business, where he teaches entrepreneurship and innovation. And he spent a decade from the late 90s to 2010 founding the Boston History and Innovation Collaborative and leading it. And he has a BA in history from Harvard University and advanced degrees from Boston College. Alan Earls is a Boston area writer who is focused on high-tech innovation and has been writing in this area for 30 years. And he has authored or edited more than a dozen books on innovation and entrepreneurship, and is a regional historian as well. So the title of the book that's the focus of the talk this evening is Boston Made: From Revolution to Robotics, Innovations That Changed the World. So without further ado, here is Bob with the book.
So we started this journey back in the fall of 1997 in order to gather information originally for what was going to be a coach tour, a bus tour of sites of Boston historical innovation. And we knew about some of these, maybe a dozen or 20 of them at first, and we started looking for more. And eventually, over the first 2-3 years up through the year 2000, we involved first a couple of dozen people, and one of those people, Alice Bolter, is with us, I can see tonight. It's great to see a veteran of the collaborative. And eventually involving hundreds and hundreds of people and organizations in this decades-long quest. By 2005, we had identified 300 innovations, and a few years later, we exceeded 400. All 400 plus of these innovations were ones that originated in Greater Boston or Massachusetts, depending on how one is looking at it geographically. And the important thing is that they changed the nation or the world. It wasn't just an innovation that was in this area, but really changed how life was lived in other places. So the question for us working on this innovation project, or innovation trail as we first called it, was why was Boston so innovative over time? Frankly, we had been very surprised that there were more than 50 or 75 innovations that had changed the nation, the world, that came out of the area. And as it got to 200 and 250, 300, 400, as I was mentioning, we really were like beginning to come to this question. And I was apprehensive because we're getting some good press about the thing. So people were going to ask me, why was Boston so innovative over time? And that really became the reason for us continuing along this road. So the first conclusion that we reached, and that is part of the introductory part of the Boston Made book, is that the sheer number and breadth of innovations at 400 plus is perhaps unmatched by any other city. We've looked at other cities, none have studied them the way we have studied Boston. And so it's not like Silicon Valley has a number there, but is much more recent. And when you're looking at London and Paris and other places in China and Japan and other places, none claim the sort of thing which we have in the Boston area. So as I mentioned, it was this root of the why. And Boston, as I'm sure a lot of you who are part of the group that is around the Old Schwamb Mill, has been studied over the ages, as we might say, but never had anybody ever written or portrayed the area as one of the leading innovation centers of the world, if not the innovation center. And so it's interesting to us, and maybe in the question and answer, I hope to find out from you what your view is after hearing a little bit of what we have found along the way. So one of the people who sort of agrees with this perspective is the Boston Globe innovation columnist, been writing weekly columns now for 20 years, Scott Kersner. And as he says, Boston consistently punches way above its weight. I mean, we're not population-wise one of the biggest cities in the world, yet we have this connection with innovation. We were asked, after we'd been working on this in 2005 by leaders in state government and something called the Massachusetts Technology Collaborative, to study this question. You know, why innovative over time? And this led us into a question, which is how to study it. And so we eventually reached the conclusion that we should study it by looking at why each of the innovations happened here and happened at a particular time. So as I said, we decided to look and see why was this area so innovative? And we reached the conclusion that we should look at all these different reasons that we had heard from a number of people in the greater Boston area as to why the city was so innovative. One of the most popular ones is, well, it's because we have 60 higher education institutions and colleges in the area. Other people said, no, it was because of number 5 here, mass education. This is the first place to have public education, and that led to the industrialization in the 19th century. Other people said, no, it was because of immigration. Others along the way said that it was because we're a hub of transportation. In any case, about 40 were suggested to us as reasons for why the area is so innovative. And we tried to eliminate some duplication and came to about 24 drivers was what it was. So we decided what we would do in looking at why this area punches above its weight was to take each of the 24 drivers and to compare them with 50 out of the 400 innovations and see which were the drivers or which were the reasons why that particular innovation had happened. And so that's what we did with the funding that we received from a large variety of sources. As I said, by this time, we really had hundreds of people involved with it. So here's what we found. our second major conclusion. We found that there were 5 drivers out of the 24, which we, in comparing them with each of the innovations. The first one that was there in almost all is that there were dynamic entrepreneurs, and it could be one entrepreneur, it could have been a group. By entrepreneur, we don't necessarily mean a business person, and more a leader of doing something innovative. Second was that almost all of the innovations were ones that the entrepreneurs worked with a vibrant network of people in the area, or a cluster, as economists would say. And so it wasn't sole entrepreneurs who were doing this on their own, but really a group of people working on it. And third is that they found that when they invented something or came up with a new idea about something, that there were early adopters, people who wanted to take that idea and to use it in the sense of a product, or use the service or the bigger idea along the way. So local demand was important. And fourth, in order to get the innovation going, it needed to have funding. But unlike a lot of other cities, the funding in Boston was more local than regional or national or global. So along the way, then something else happened. We found that particularly the people who had gotten this new innovation going were very good at reaching out to a global market and to reaching whether it was China or South America or Central Europe along the way in Germany and France and England. So 5 drivers that really came out of those 24. It wasn't always the universities or the colleges that played that role. In fact, most of the time, it was people who came here for the college who were involved, but had gone on to do something beyond the college along the way. We found then that 4 out of these 5 drivers were local in nature, and we came to call the force of these 4 or 5 working together as the bump and connect. The idea that in a smaller city, people tended to talk with each other, not always civilly to each other. They were always competing with each other along the way. But this was what we found was the reason for so many innovations happening in this area that then spread into the world. So the stories. Well, the first of these stories that I'd like to get into with you is Alexander Graham Bell. As most of you, I'm sure, know, he's credited with inventing the telephone. But one of the things that we looked at was, this is a man who was brought up in Scotland, lived in Edinburgh, educated there. He was not from Boston, never had visited the United States at all along the way, and then had worked in London for a while and had studied and worked in business there. And then third, had come to the Western Hemisphere, but he went through Canada and stayed for a year and a half in Brantford, Ontario along the way. So what brought Bell to Boston was 2 things. One, there was a college in Boston, which would later be called Boston University, and he was a teacher to the deaf, mainly high school students at the time, and he had been trained in it. His family was very involved with teaching the deaf at a really a global level and coming out of Scotland. And the other thing that brought him here is that he was very interested in the electric technology that was involved in the development of the telegraph. And Boston, by the early 1870s, he arrived here in about 1872, 1873, was one of the two centers in the hemisphere for developing or redeveloping the telegraph. The telegraph had been invented actually by a guy from Charlestown, Massachusetts in the 1840s. But by the 1870s, they were looking at how to perfect it and how to have a lot more ability to have multiple telegraph signals going on at the same time. And one of the headquarter buildings for the really group of people who were working in Boston was this building at 109 Court Street. There, Charles Williams had his manufacturers of telegraphy. And that was a building that Bell came to quite a bit. It turned out it was only 6 or 7 blocks from where Boston University was in a little bit different section of the downtown near the Boston Common. And the Telegraph Building is about where the federal JFK building is in Boston in the City Hall. And Bell was very interested in setting up shop there, and he did that by renting out a garret on the top floor. You can see the inside of the garret in this image here from the early 1870s. Ironically, one of the labs in the building on the first or second floor had been used by another person who you probably heard of, Thomas Alva Edison. And ironically, we have two of the greatest inventors or innovators of the 19th century had worked within a floor of each other in this building in Boston, saying something about what a center of Boston was for technological innovation at the time. In any case, Bell met somebody who was working at the telegraph company on the first floor, a guy named Thomas Watson. Here's an image of him from 1874. Watson was a great maker of models that had electricity in them. And Bell took him from working for the telegraph company to working up in the garret with him. And Bell hired other people. Along the way, he hired a guy named Lewis Latimer, a son of runaway slaves from South Carolina who had been stowaways who'd come to Chelsea. And Latimer himself had been educated on drawing of patents, and he was a great draftsman. He later became a scientist himself, working with Edison. And here's the patent diagram that he drew in March of 1876. And it shows the two different phones and their connections with each other. And there was a couple of weeks after the filing for that, Bell was really hard up for cash. How was he going to pay Watson and Latimer and some of the others who were part of his network at the time? And he approached several different people. The one who he had the most success with was this man named Gardner Green Hubbard. Hubbard was an investor in the city, and he felt that Bell was really on the right track on this. And he brought in another financier from Boston, a guy named Thomas Sanders. And so Bell, by this point then, was able to continue his work in that spring of 1876. And here is in late March of 1876, Bell working with what he has in his hand is actually the first horns that were used as telephones. And he just has spilled all of this acid from the bottle on his bench over here. You can see some of the batteries that he has over here and some of the wires and otherwise. And Bell yells out, in pain, he said, "Watson, come here, I need you." And Watson was in a different room behind a very thick door, but was connected by wire to where Bell was. And so they had succeeded at doing something which nobody had ever done before, which is to hear the human voice over an electric wire. And this is what Bell had been working on. His financier was actually less interested in this than something else called the harmonic telegraph. But news spread from that garret in late March that this guy Bell in the city was on to something really big. And Bell, working with Watson and a couple of others, did experiments where they showed the connection between two different wires and people, not just within one building, but then between buildings, and eventually one crossing the Charles River to the Athenaeum building in Cambridge. It became such a cause célèbre that there was a large World's Fair type of event being held that July 4th, the 100th anniversary of the centennial of the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia. And Bell was invited to show his invention to a group of very powerful and wealthy scientific sort of people. The president of American Telegraph at the time, later Telephone and Telegraph, was there. The Emperor of Brazil and the head of the Smithsonian, the first head of the Smithsonian, were there. And Bell was able to recreate a conversation, and in fact, one that had better volume than had ever happened in the Boston ones. And he was widely applauded. And by the time he left Philadelphia 2 days later, the Boston newspapers had picked up on, the local man who really had made good. And Bell went back to 109 Court Street, and the owner there, Charles Williams, said, Alec, you really have succeeded. I want one of those. I want to buy one of these. And so Bell, without having had one constructed, said, "Okay, Charles, you can have it." And Charles said, "Well, I want two. I want to have one in my office here and one in my home 4 miles away in Somerville." And Bell said, "Okay, you have number 1 and number 2." And so that's how the first telephone numbers got given out in this new invention. Very soon, a couple of months later in the fall, they were building telephones in the Telegraph building there, and Williams himself was helping with that. And by 7 or 8 months, England had heard about the big breakthrough, and Queen Victoria invited Bell to come to Buckingham Palace to do a demonstration of it. And it was so successful that within 3 months after that, Bell was having telephones built in London. So in sum on this thing, we took something which was really an idea 8 or 9 months before and was being produced in 2 cities on 2 different continents. And going back to what we had found theoretically when we looked at this thing, you had a dynamic entrepreneur in Bell, and you certainly had a vibrant network with Watson doing his models and otherwise, and Latimer, and with Gardner Green Hubbard and Sanders and other people. And they got the local funding, and they certainly had early adopters who wanted to buy it, and they succeeded globally. So we didn't just find these 5 drivers once, but over and over again, as we learned more about 50 of the 400 stories, not in every one, but in a vast number of them, most of these drivers were there, or all. And that was true not just in this particular era in the 1860s and 70s, when MIT was first invented, and Cambridge and that sort of thing, but this went back 100 or 200 years and would later go forward. But I've been talking about one just in technology. Alan is going to tell us a little bit the story of one in the healthcare world. Alan?
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, this is a brief summary of the really interesting career of an entrepreneur, if you will, Dr. Sidney Farber, who was a pathologist at Children's Hospital in the 1940s. And this was a time when a serious disease for children then, as now, was childhood leukemia. And unfortunately, at the time, it was almost invariably a fatal disease, 85% mortality at the time. And this was something that I'm sure bothered Dr. Farber, so much so that he started thinking about whether there wasn't some way to change that issue and improve the survival rate. And it so happened that in his career, he had learned that folic acid sustains and stimulates the growth of bone marrow. And that, of course, is the seat of the disease leukemia. So he reasoned, freshly, I think it was a unique insight, that if you could interrupt the folic acid that feeds bone marrow or sustains bone marrow, you could probably potentially interrupt the leukemia. He didn't get a whole lot of support for that, but he pursued the idea relentlessly and eventually was able to invent this molecule, aminopterin, that did exactly that. It suppressed the access to folic acid. And when it was tested on children at Children's Hospital, the first 16 children it was tested on, 10 were able to go into remission quite rapidly, which was an astounding accomplishment at the time. And that alone, one would think, would have made Farber's fame and fortune. But there was a considerable amount of skepticism. For one thing, he was a pathologist, not an oncologist. He didn't come from a research background. So we had a lot of trouble getting support from grantors and from others in the medical community. But being the entrepreneurial type, he found some non-conventional ways of moving ahead and persisted, and became in the process the father of modern chemotherapy. This consisted of sort of a lucky break. There was a group called the Variety Club from the entertainment industry in New England that was looking for a cause or an individual to support, and they found out about him and began to provide support for his research. In addition, at about the same time, there had been a young boy named Jimmy who had been featured on radio and then I think later on TV as a sufferer from leukemia. And this became the germ of what became the Jimmy Fund, now famous and well established in Boston. And that was another funding stream. An additional element to that, and sort of a sub-innovation, was that the sports teams in Boston, the Red Sox and the Boston Braves, groups that had hitherto been perfectly content to just be entertaining sports figures, put some muscle, so to speak, behind this and got some publicity for the Jimmy Fund, aligned their efforts with the fundraising. And before you know it, it was a very successful thing that brought a lot of further funding to Dr. Farber. And of course, he had this great network of people, doctors that were very concerned about their patients, doctors who had kids with leukemia and parents. And by using all of those attributes, he was able to bring us to where today Dana-Farber is, after his passing, unfortunately, is a world-renowned institution for research into cancer, the care of cancer patients, and innovative treatments. And as with Bell, one can see the same sorts of processes. Farber, the dynamic entrepreneur, the vibrant networking cluster of other medical people who are aligned with his concerns, parents, the clear local demand, and local funding, which was really, really crucial to getting him established, which ultimately led to global funding and global demand. And again, the four of those were the local bump and connect story that Bob has talked about before. And we have a lot of other stories like this. I think Bob will introduce several more that are in our book.
Yeah, so here's just a dozen more out of, again, the 400, or part of the 50. at Mass General in 1846, Dr. William Morton introduced anesthesia for the first time successfully, which allowed for one to be able to operate within the body cavity and change the whole nature of surgery in the world. And that came out in October of 1846. That same fall, over in Central Square, we have Elias Howe invented the sewing machine. And moving down, King Gillette, who invented the safety razor down on Atlantic Avenue around 1902, 1903, changed the whole world, in this case on shaving. Others, we have image of the first house, which was the first school in North America, and Boston Latin School being the first school. Interestingly enough, there was 70 years between when it was founded and when New York City had its first public school, to give you some idea about how far ahead we were here. Next is our two gentlemen who are both brothers. The first transplant of an organ happened at the Brigham Hospital, in this case, the kidney transplant in 1954. And the microwave oven out at Raytheon and Waltham, and the chocolate chip cookie at the Toll House with Whittam. And in Woburn, you have Charles Goodyear, who vulcanized rubber. Took decades and decades, and he did a lot of his experimenting literally in the poorhouse and debtor's prison, where he was, not poorhouse. And then
Sound.
What happened? Did we lose Bob?
Yeah, we lost the sound.
Well,
It looks like we lost his
we
picture
lost them
too.
all together. Yeah.
Let me see if I can call
mute
him.
myself. Okay, can you hear me now? Can you hear
Are
me?
you there, Bob? Yes, we can hear you, just can't see you.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, great, okay. And so other inventions, in this case, a social one, the Massachusetts is the first state to allow marriage equality in 2003. The first subway in the Western Hemisphere, the third one in the world at Park Street Station in 1897. And we could go on and on. But in any case, we have these 400 Boston-born innovations. And by the way, along the way, there's hundreds more that I'm aware of that we've never studied. We just haven't continued the resources as we had before, though as we saw happen almost miraculously in the end of December and the first weeks of January.
Okay, it's frozen.
Losing again, Bob. We've lost you, Bob.
Yeah, he's gone now.
If we have to, I can continue for us in a moment. Let me see if we can get him.
There he's signing in again.
Okay, good.
I'm not sure if he signed in again or if he just, or if the connection just healed itself, but it's not successful. All right.
So go far.
There he goes.
Supreme Court rule.
Yeah, I don't think he knows.
Yeah. And are we stuck here, I guess?
We
were.
Yeah.
lost you for a
Yeah.
few minutes.
Yeah.
And
So you're in with Mumbat?
Okay, no material.
Bob.
So,
Yeah.
uh,
Want me to continue
Yeah.
for a minute? Okay,
yeah,
I'll
but
try
you
it.
can hear me. So, okay.
Yeah, we can only hear you part of the
Okay.
time, so I'll just try to go through
So,
these slides. Okay, I'm going to give it a
yeah.
go.
So,
Okay,
in any
as
case, our book, Boston Made, as you can see, it tells 50 stories of innovations along the way, and lots of images. The book is written as a book to be read, not as an academic tryst. That came from one city and one state. And as I was beginning to say, there are a number of major social innovations that have come from this area. Included in those social innovations are ones where social norms have been changed. One of the most important that's ever really happened in the state was one that began because of slavery in Massachusetts, which started just 8 years after the colony had been founded. And here we have a picture of the slave quarters in Medford of the royal plantation back from the 18th century. In the late 18th century, we were really the place where the ending of slavery began. And that happened related to the fact that we had our first constitution after we had liberation at the evacuation day in Boston in the late 1770s. And John Adams, who wrote the Constitution, wrote the preamble, included in there the phrase, "All men are born free and equal." And the first Constitution also had something innovative happening with it, which is that it was the first time that a Constitution had ever been put to a referendum of the voters in a country or in a state. And so the Constitution needed to be read to the people of Massachusetts. And that happened in both big towns like Boston, as well as small towns like out in Sheffield in the Berkshires. And there, a African-American woman, enslaved African-American woman, whose name was Mumbet, heard the preamble being read about being born free and equal. And she, after that, hearing that at the outside meeting, obtained a local lawyer who brought a case before the local jury in this town in the Berkshires. And the jury there decided that Mumbet was being held in slavery illegally, and that the owners should pay a fine for having enslaved her. The owners went to the new state Supreme Court, and there the state Supreme Court heard both her case as part of a larger case with a male slave who had run away from in Worcester County, Massachusetts. And the state Supreme Judicial Court's appellate review granted both freedom. And within 9 years, by 1790, and here's the actual document from the Mass Historical Society here, slavery in Massachusetts was forever abolished, the first state among the 13. To just give you again some comparison point, slavery was one that was abolished, but only gradually in New York State. It took until 1837, 57 years after Massachusetts, before New York abolished slavery, to give you some idea of that. Well, we're moving on in time here, but to try to summarize, and besides everything that we have talked about that we found about innovation, we also found out that in spite of this high degree of innovation in the greater Boston area, that Boston had had 4 major economic collapses that in its 400-year history. And each time there was a new wave of innovation that came and brought back the economy in terms of being an innovative economy. That happened in the 1640s. and the place came back in the 1650s to the point where by 1720, Boston was the third largest port in the entire British Empire, from places in India all the way to here. And then the second time that we came back was right after the Revolution. 85% of the population of Boston had either died or left Boston by the liberation in March of 1776. The economy came back when it looked, and a lot of people assumed that it wouldn't. The China trade started to develop, and the textile industry in Waltham. And then a third wave of innovation happening in the 1850s when the sailing ship economy collapsed. And we came back again with shoes and textiles and the manufacture of phones. AT&T was based in Boston until the 1915, 1920. And then lastly, the decline of the Massachusetts shoe and textile industries from the 1920s through the 1960s. And again, in this case, the electronic industry, which had developed around Route 128 that Alan has studied so deeply. Mutual funds were invented in Boston, and finance, IT and high tech out in Metro West and those areas, and biotech, of course, in Kendall Square more recently. So three major conclusions have come out of this work that we had started on and hit on really, in a way that's shocked us or surprised us 20 years ago. Now, less shock and more wanting other people to know that this is our history. This area is one of the most innovative places, cities, or states, however you want to put it, certainly in the United States, given the number 400 that we have cataloged and many more that we haven't. And it's one of the most innovative in the world. In fact, no other city has ever cataloged what we've done. This is our story. This is really your story as well. One that we have always felt intuitively we have something to say, but we never really have tried to prove it before. And there, I want to rest our case and take your questions. But we think we've hit on something that we ask you to take more seriously than I think many of us had before.
Thanks very much, folks. And a reminder, please submit your questions if you can through the chat, which is at the bottom of your screen. We've already got a few that have been coming in during your talk, gentlemen.
Okay.
Someone wants to know, when you started, what was your method for discovering past innovations that originated in the area?
Our method was gathering people from a number of different organizations in the city. A lot of hospitals and companies had archivists, and we began to work with some of those people along the way. And then where there weren't archivists, many times there were companies saying, look, we're the first to have invented the this thing or something else, the microwave oven at Raytheon, for example, or basketball along the way, or even the literary tradition in the United States of breaking off our culture from Britain in terms of the literary revolution of the 1830s and 40s. So we touched base with a larger and larger group of people along the way, and developed a group of about 50 to 100 different organizations working on this. So that's a long answer to a short question, but it really came out of surprises that there were so many that had never really been put together.
We have a question from one of our past presenters, Susan Wilson. She wants to know if you touched on any literary innovations in the Boston area. And by literary, I suppose she means both.
As I was saying, yes, I mean, really the development of an American um, uh, movement in the 1830s and 40s with Louisa May Alcott later on, but with certainly with Emerson and Margaret Fuller and others at the time. We developed a culture that was far different than the where the British culture went in the 1840s. So we've had many different schools of thought on the literary side and other sides that have come out of Boston.
We have another question. My understanding is that a Tufts professor developed a telephone at the same time as Bell, but was mere days late with his patent application. Are you familiar
Yes.
with the
Yes.
story? And do you know if they knew each other?
He was not at Tufts. He was from Chicago, and his name was Asa Gray. And the both Bell and Asa Gray filed their patent diagrams and cases from the same post office at the Old State House in Boston on the same day in March of 1876. The earlier postmark was the one that Bell had done and that had been drawn by Lewis Latimer along the way. And Gray brought a case against this, which became the longest single patent case in the history of the United States. It went on for 15 or 20 years. And finally, Bell won that. There are still people today who dispute that Bell was the person who invented the telephone and feel that it was stolen from Gray along the way. I've read both sides of it and disagree, but yeah.
And there were quite a few claimants at that time with varying degrees of basis in fact, as often happens with a success like this. It has many parents, or at least attempted parents, but Bell's claim seems to have stood up the most over time.
Yeah.
A question: did your study include Robert Goddard? You know who?
Yes, one of the 50 is Robert Goddard, and his work at Clark University in Worcester, and the first rocket that ever went up into the air, and at least on the edge of the atmosphere, was launched from his aunt's farm just west of Worcester. And Goddard at the time was seen as a fool and an idiot, and the New York Times had that on the front page that this was preposterous that it would go anyplace. And really, the naming the control center in Maryland after Goddard was really an attempt to, after Goddard had died and seen as a fool by the Worcester newspapers and others, that he really had come up with both the theories, but he had made it happen. And one of the things of Massachusetts and a lot of Boston innovations is we not only have come up with the theories, but we made that happen. And all of the 400 innovations that we talk about in the book are not ones that stayed at the theoretical level. We only looked at ones that had become, as the case with Goddard, a household word, or Bell in terms of the actual telephone that was used along the way. So we go one step further than saying, well, which is true, Massachusetts has an incredible number of patents that have been done over time, but it's not the patent that's the critical thing. The critical thing is, did it change lives and improve the living of lives in the United States? And that's been our strength. And I'm not saying that there haven't been incredible things that have been proven theoretically. I mean, and there are so many things along the way. The word technology, for example, was invented by a Harvard professor named Bigelow in 1828. And, you know, so there are things that are not included in my 400, but really have done something along the way.
Second part of that question, by the way, how close to Boston did one have to live to get the benefits of the synergies you described? And I suppose you could take that question in a number of ways.
You can take that question a number of ways. In part, a number of innovations, and let's take the idea, Charles Goodyear, who I said did his major work on inventing on rubber, vulcanization it's called, up in Woburn. However, the first industrial use of rubber was in Springfield, Massachusetts. And so Springfield claims, you know, well, really rubber was invented there. But the patents and the first rubber products were all done in Woburn and that sort of thing. So do we give it one place or another in terms of looking at the literary history? You know, much of that happened in Cambridge and Concord, and others of it happened further west in Massachusetts with Dickinson and others. So we essentially, for our work, have seen Greater Boston being the standard metropolitan statistical area, which goes as far as Worcester and down to Providence in southern New Hampshire. And so it's not just the culture of the city of Boston or the former town of Boston along the way.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'm seeing a note from Susan Wilson about Toll House cookies. So there, you know, it's south of Boston as opposed to west or north of Boston, but it was within the imperial area of Boston, I suppose.
Yeah, and
so,
to her point, are there any other culinary innovations described, or that you, even if they're not in the book?
Well, there are a number of innovations that have been made. In fact, Susan is the person who's educated me in terms of the work of Fanny Farmer and her Boston cooking school, which was near Kenmore Square. And Fanny Farmer introduced the whole idea of scientific measurements instead of a pinch of something and that sort of thing. She really introduced how you could produce things at much more of an area. So there's a number of different culinary breakthroughs in the Boston area, starting with our clam chowder. So
another question, is anyone applying your method of analysis to innovation in other cities, such as Philadelphia, New York, Chicago?
Well, no, that hasn't happened. One of the reasons for doing the book is to say, okay, and we in fact say this in the book, we're interested in seeing, is there really competition around this? The only city that has done something like this is Baltimore, and they have about 82 or 78 innovations. I don't remember the exact number right now, but that includes the birthday of Key, who wrote the poem, you know, of the Star Spangled Banner and that sort of thing. We haven't included people's birthdays in Boston, even though Franklin was born here, not in Philadelphia. But there's a book on San Diego that looks at their innovations, and they have 10. And they're significant, but it's all happened in the last 60 years. And pretty much the last 30 years. There are certainly cities, London, Paris and Berlin and places in China and places in Japan that have substantial number of innovations, and where printing was invented in China. I know a number of other things, and some of the printing thing goes back to 400 AD. So in some sense, we're parochial around Boston, and in some sense we're not. But really, the more the analysis gets publicity, the greater the possibility of really seeing what other cities come to this. But we've worked at this now since 1997, and so we think that we can stand up and defend ourselves in the court of innovation along the way.
I think we have one last question, and maybe it's a good one to close on. This has got two parts to it. How is digital technology, here we are doing it now, and the ability to collaborate remotely affected your central theory, and will innovation continue to be so closely tied to geography going forward?
It's something, obviously, in the last 15, 16 months that we're looking at what has been this bump of connect, and saying, well, we absolutely are in a culture right now in terms of social distancing that says you are not allowed to bump and connect very easily. And the decline in using, having central corporate offices and all of this, I think we have to see how that is. There was a great piece in the Sunday Ideas section of the Globe saying that this doing without corporate headquarters and without bringing people together and as much is going to fade quite a bit over time. And they provided 3 or 4 very strong reasons. And I would ask you to go back and take a look at that. And among the, let's say, the scholars of the Bump and Connect, people that I've worked with outside of the Boston area as well as here, there's a feeling of, well, it may be that this really is happening and we aren't going to have the closeness, or that the digital does allow for an awful lot of contact, though it's the randomness of people by expression on their faces and by talking about things and probing with other people that is a lot of the bump and connect, a lot of the why certain things were able to coalesce has an awful lot to do with the randomness of communication on different levels that people have. And I teach innovation quite a bit, so I could give you lots of different examples. And if you want to send me your address, I'd be glad to share with you some of those examples along the way.
So that question was from our friend Stroker. So Stroker, feel free to send along an email or let me know if you want us to share it. And we'll let Robert Krim know.
Great, be glad to. I
Thanks.
may ask for Alan. This isn't only me along the way.
Oh, for sure. For sure.
Yeah. Sure. Well, it's been a pleasure for us to present to this group tonight. And we so thank the Old Schwamb Mill for holding this tonight. And this is how good ideas can spread to other places, even digitally.
Yeah, and of course, this talk will be available on our website once we've edited it. Ed, is there anything you want to say in closing about upcoming events at the Mill?
Our show, In the Spirit of the Dutch Golden Age, the still life photography of Brian Maguire, will be available to the public through June 26th. And then we have a painting and sculpture show opening July 24th. The paintings of Dan Schonfrini, Gwen Chasen, and Bill Cohn, and that's on a Saturday, July 24, and we're still kind of getting the fall together, so stay tuned. But thank you so much, Bob and Alan. That was really, really interesting, and
Thank you. for
And
having
I
us.
have
Appreciate
a question. Could you just talk a little about the exhibit that was at Logan Airport on innovation that you put together?
It still is there, by the way.
It's still there? Okay.
Yeah, and there's a good overlap between the two, not 100%. That is 50 innovations. There are a couple that are not in the Logan one for various reasons, but are in the book and the other way around. But you can see that there. It's between the International Terminal E and Terminal C, which is where JetBlue is. You have to be traveling somewhere to see it. But what is fun about that is the publisher of our book is somebody who had seen the exhibit and then sent me a contract through the mail. We never had to go around with a full version of a book already written, and just said, here's a contract. This would be great as a book. Please do it. And so I said to Alan, I certainly need help on this. And you are the guy who knows technology and otherwise. I need to have that so that we could write this thing together over the last 3 years. But the exhibit itself sort of prompted the book along the way. Though we had done a children's version of this book in 2007 for third grade Massachusetts history. And that's out of print right now, but it has a lot of the stuff which this book has. And thank God we have lots of images in this book, so that it's as readable as a third grade book is. So, well, thank you very much.
Thanks very much for joining us, and we'll
Okay.
hopefully see you at the mill soon as we are now open again.
Well, it's a great place, and I'm actually hoping to see it this coming weekend. So,
Great.
yeah.
Thanks again.
Okay.